Hi everybody and welcome back to Exotics of the World TV. Now in this episode we are going to be talking about the basic care of Pac-Man frogs, and I am joined by a very special guest. Now when you see her you may think it's Rogue from the early 2000 X-Men films, but it's not. It's my friend, my pal, my rotten soldier, my good time boy, Ellie Hills. So say hello, Ellie.
Hello. I wanted to really do the like diddly.
We might get copyright struck for that, but hi ho.
Know where I was going with just that little snippet.
I know exactly where you're going with it. But yeah, right. Anyway, with that, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the content. So, as with all species, let's talk about this animal's country of origin. So, Ellie, where are these guys endemic to?
They kind of run along the ridge of South America up to like Argentina. They're kind of found in like Brazil and those kind of like pockets of areas.
And what kind of like biomes and stuff are these guys going to inhabit?
Mainly like marshy kind of damp soil with some kind of like water source. They're not found in particularly dry areas. They might live in areas where there are dry seasons, which they can brumate through, which I'm sure we'll go through later. But usually it's quite tropical, wet, but not too hot kind of habitat.
Now, in terms of like enclosure size for these, what would you suggest? Now, is this an animal that we are going to pop straight away into its forever enclosure, or is this going to be an animal that we're going to need to upgrade slowly but surely?
So the wild isn't doesn't have a size limit, and I say this with everything. If you're keeping an animal correctly, you should be able to pop it in the adult size enclosure, and that would be a 3 foot. However, if you're willing to spend the money on the upgrades in between, then you definitely could start out smaller. It all depends on what size you buy your frog. Some of them start out. I bought my one at the size of a 50p piece, so like really, really tiny. So yeah, he's just a little baby. So popping him straight into 3 foot, I think I would struggle to find him. But that's on my part, not that he wouldn't have thrived in there.
Yeah, so I think for us here, what we would typically say, it's basically what you're comfortable with. If you're getting your frog that's like the size of like a 50p or a £2, anything like that, maybe something you could start off with something a little bit smaller. But if you wanted to go for something larger straight away, then you can do. Now, in terms of dimensions, we would typically say very similar to what you said, Ellie, a 3 foot by 18 by 18, literally as a kind of like bare minimum for when this animal is fully grown.
One thing that's important to remember is that they do defecate and urate into the soil. So the more soil you have in that enclosure, the more that gets diluted. So one of the things that they're really vulnerable to is when they're a sit and wait predator, they'll defecate and then they will sit there. If you've only got a small amount of soil, it very quickly becomes very acidic. So if you have a bigger enclosure with a deeper substrate, you're going to have to worry about that a lot less.
With quite a lot of frogs that we've spoken about already on the channel, so like a lot of tree frogs, that type of thing, you can cohab them. Is this something that you can cohab or not?
If you want 1 megawatt at the end of it, sure.
Obviously, I asked that question just to have a little bit of a joke. Yeah, definitely do not house these frogs together because, just like Ellie said, by the end of it, you will get one mega frog. So. So, would you say then, Ellie, that these frogs are like quite cannibalistic with each other?
Yeah, they are very much like a sit and wait predator. So if you think about an alligator or like a crocodile, something like that, they have the same kind of response where if anything moves or anything like that, their response is to quickly just like chomp. They've only got one chance at eating that prey. So it's very much more like a trigger automatic response. So if they're moving around the enclosure or anything like that, then they will just basically consume whatever's in front of them. And unfortunately, that is usually tank mates.
So you've already like kind of like touched a little bit on it, but in terms of like cleaning, how often should we be realistically cleaning these animals out? So as they are a sit and wait predator and they do like defecate and urate and whatnot and like sit in it and stuff, obviously there is the potential there for the animal to get sick or injured from its own fecal matter. So how often would you typically recommend to clean out Pac-Man frogs?
It entirely depends on what kind of setup you've got. So I've gone for a bioactive, so I actually have never changed the substrate. I've definitely added to it, but I've never taken anything out. But that has plants in it, that has isopods, that has springtails, and I'm also just checking the quality of the soil and taking out any large matter that I can find. If you're not going to go down that route, then you need to be checking that weekly just to make sure there's no feces in that, and then I would do at least partial changes every single month.
So in terms of like heating, we'll talk about heating first, then we'll potentially go into other forms of lighting. So there's quite a bit of controversy online when it comes to the heating of Pac-Man frogs. So some people say that they are thermoconformers and that room temperature is absolutely fine for them. Some people say, no, don't do that, use a ceramic heat emitter. And some people say just use red spot bulbs. Some people say just use Baskin spot bulbs, etc., etc. So just to like try and like clear up some of this misinformation, what would you typically recommend and suggest?
So I would recommend a halogen, and I know that shocks quite a few people. If you think their temperatures that you're kind of trying to achieve is around 24 Celsius, so you're only going to need a really low wattage bulb. But if the heat mats putting them on the bottom of the tank is completely unnatural, not only do they have to come in surface with the heat mat to kind of find any sort of heat, but they would naturally burrow down into the soil to get cooler. And then we're popping the heat mat on the bottom. They're just going to try and burrow down and get warmer and warmer and just burn themselves. So it's a lot better to have the heat source from the top naturally, such as a halogen. Things like ceramic heat emitters are completely not natural. They don't have the right infrared at all. So it's better to provide a halogen, which does.
So you've spoken about the misinformation stuff out there, and exactly like you, I would also recommend using halogen Baskin spots for my frogs. Now, if you are somewhere that gets typically cold, you can utilize things like ceramic heat sources, but you're not going to be using them as a main heat source. This is literally just to keep the ambient temperature up inside your enclosure. Now, this is if the enclosure or the room that it's going in is dropping quite low on a nighttime. So we've spoken a little bit about the environment and stuff that these guys come from. You've mentioned, Ellie, that they'll typically find like tropical, kind of like marshy, like areas next to like water sources and stuff. So in terms of humidity, is humidity something that we really need to worry about?
Yeah, so they do require humidity, and it depends on what species of um, Pac-Man frog you're talking about. Our typical one that we would see in the pet trade is the Cranwelli, and they're probably one of the more drier species, so they can tolerate lower humidity levels. However, if you drop too low, they go into like a torpor brumation where they kind of like wrap themselves in dead skin. Um, we don't really want to see that in captivity. So you want to be keeping their soil nice and damp. And I tend to go for like a gradient. So you have one end that's quite dry, and then as it progresses, you get more and more kind of like waterlogged. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So why would you do it as a gradient? Why not just have like all of the substrate in there at kind of like the same moistness? If we can use that word without too many people cringing.
So I am a big advocate for choice. So the Pac-Man frog might decide that they want to be drier or wetter that day, and just providing a gradient gives them agency over deciding where they do want to sit on that gradient level. And also, it's just easier, especially if you are worried about keeping them too wet or too dry. They will control that for you, so you don't have to worry.
So in terms of like percentage points and stuff, so obviously when we look at care guides and whatnot, we'll typically say like a range, like I don't know, between like 50 and 60% humidity. What would you say for your Pac-Man frogs?
Um, I'd say somewhere between, like, your lowest point is kind of like 60%, and then you want to go kind of higher up to spikes of 100.
So what about temperature then? So we've discussed about like the basking spot temperatures and whatnot. So what would you say for an ambient temperature, both in the daytime and nighttime, for a Pac-Man frog?
I kind of aim for just an ambient air temperature of around like 23, 22. I tend to find that the frog sits there quite nicely at that temperature. Nighttime, I drop it to like maybe 18, 17 Celsius. It's really good for them to have a nighttime drop. A lot of the time, people keep them too hot, and it doesn't give their immune systems a chance to recover or go into a healing state and all of those kind of things. So it's nice to allow them to kind of have that drop. And actually, a lot of Pac-Man frogs in captivity suffer from heat stress, and we don't even realize it, but they are literally frying the frogs.
So you mentioned about using a halogen spot bulb for obviously the primary source of heat in there. So are we going to be using that as like a basking spot? Will the animal bask like reptiles and stuff do? Or will the frog literally just like frizzle out and, you know, become like a crisp?
I don't know where it came from, where this concept that amphibians are just thigmoconformers and they can't have any agency or control over their own. So it's a complete fallacy that a Pac-Man frog will sit there in under the basking spot and it won't move away when it gets too hot. Like, that animal has survived since the dinosaur time. There were giant Pac-Man frogs and they survived the meteorites. Okay, so they do have some kind of like survival instincts in there. They will move away to the cooler side or they will bury themselves down. So I wouldn't be afraid to offer them a nice warm basking spot.
Yeah. So Pac-Man frogs can survive meteors, but not halogen basking spot bulbs. So so in terms of the temperature then for your like for your little basking area, what would you say is kind of like the maximum that you would go to?
Anything over 24, then I'm concerned that they're gonna kind of like over. I mean, you could go up to 25, 27 if you have just the ability to get away. But the problem is, it all depends on your ventilation. If your basking spot is increasing the ambient air temperature, then you need to reduce the basking spot. It's a difficult one to kind of answer, I think.
Yeah. So, but as long as like the bulb itself is giving like a reading of around about 24-ish with air temperatures sitting around about 22, 23, then we should be absolutely fine.
Yeah, so I always use the back of my hand test. So when you're putting your hand under the bulb where that soil is going to be, do you feel your hand is hot and you can't put under it? Does it feel like it's just a gentle, you can just about feel that heat? That's probably really nice. Anything over that where the soil is getting really hot or you can't put your hand on it, that is way too hot.
So, moving on to thermostats. This is the piece of equipment that is going to help regulate the temperature inside your enclosure. So, because we're going to be using a light emitting heat source, we would always recommend using a dimming thermostat. So, moving on to arguably a controversial topic, although I don't understand why it is a controversial topic. And I'm assuming you also don't think it's a controversial topic, Ellie, is UVB. Now, when obviously doing a little bit of reading online, we'll typically say that they don't need UVB, etc., etc. Is this correct, or should we supply this animal with some sort of UVB?
I am really confused where the rumor came from. Pac-Man frogs are, if you look at their anatomy, their head and their skull is massive. It's one of the most calcified skulls of amphibians. That's their entire way that they hunt and eat, is through the power of their skull. So they are very, very prone to metabolic bone disease. And even when I got my Pac-Man frog when he was small, they just need a low level basking like UVI of like 1 or 2. And he sat under that basking bulb for days before he decided to burrow because he had been lacking that. I think the fear comes from that you're going to burn them, but if you're using the right UVI levels, there's no risk of that.
So, what UVI would you typically recommend using for a Pac-Man frog?
So it entirely depends. It's like asking how long is a piece of string. How far you are from the Pac-Man frog's back will entirely depend on what bulb you use. I know that's not very helpful answer, but when you are reading the UVI, you want to be having one or two. If you don't have a UVI reader, you want to be using something like a shade dweller, like a 2% bulb if you're only, kind of that far away from them, or a 6% bulb if you've kind of got those 18 inches away from their back.
Yeah, so if we've got a kind of like a 3 foot by 18 by 18, the bulb we would typically recommend would be a 6% if it's from Arcadia, a Ferguson Zone 2 bulb from Reptile Systems, a bulb that's going to produce a low amount of UVB. So, are there any other types of bulbs that we are going to be placing into this enclosure for our Pac-Man frog? So, I know with reptiles, obviously, it's super important to have like LED. LED is quite a relatively new thing where people are starting to add into their enclosures. I'm assuming it's exactly the same for our Pac-Man frogs as well.
Yep. So I have LED lighting on them as well. Not only does it help with the plant growth, but when you look at the spectrum of sunlight and things like that, in order to create as much of that as possible, you also need to be adding in LED as well.
Yeah. Also, as well, I find that it gives them a nice photo period as well. So it lets them know when it's obviously daytime, when it's nighttime, when they should be dormant, when they should be active, when it's time for hunting, etc., etc. Now, so substrate. Again, this is another topic that is extremely bizarre when you are tackling it when it comes to Pac-Man frogs. So some people say that they are fine with just wet tissue paper. Some people say that they are fine with just cocoa fiber, just orchid bark, etc., etc. So, Ellie, please help me dispel some of these myths when it comes to substrates.
Yeah, some of the stuff that I've seen has been shocking, like pond filter sponge. Um, yeah, they should have a really nice depth of some kind of safe soil, and I mixed moss and other kind of like fibrous materials into that as well. They have strong back legs that they want to dig back into the substrate. Even when you're doing bioactive, you don't want any kind of like drainage layer, because that's what they're going to dig their back legs into, and you're at risk of them like damaging themselves. So just a really nice deep substrate of different types of reptile soils. In general, I would never recommend someone who doesn't know what they're doing just going and buying any soil. Frogs are really, really prone to toxins such as fertilizers, things like that. So your safest bet would be, if you don't know any better, go to a local reptile shop and get reptile soils.
Yeah, so substrates that I typically use with Pac-Man frogs, I always like to use a mixture of different kinds of substrates. So I'll use the Lucky Reptile Jungle Earth, I will use the Arcadia Earth Mix, I'll use cocoa fibers, all sorts of, like you were saying, like fibrous substrates and stuff like that, that are also quite absorbent as well. So moving on to decor. So what kind of decor would you have inside your enclosure for your Pac-Man frog?
I personally keep it quite naturalistic, staying away from anything sharp or like plastic toys or anything like that. They are really prone to grabbing and swallowing, so I would be careful of putting anything like bark chips or rocks or anything like that that are at a swallow risk. And I tend to stay with just natural plants that are alive and kind of reptile safe.
Yeah, so basically how we would set up like a reptile bioactive, we're going to be doing exactly the same, minus obviously like the clay balls and stuff like that for our frogs. Is that kind of like the best way to do it? So I know obviously with reptiles you can get away with just using like the plastic plants and stuff, but from what you've just said, it's not something that's typically recommended anymore to use plastic with frogs.
Yeah, and with Pac-Man frogs, sometimes it's generally recommended to either use a really, really hardy plant because they're going to be burrowing. So you don't want to spend lots of money on a plant that needs nice, healthy roots and your Pac-Man frog just goes under there and tears it all up. So I know you hate it, but I use a lot of pothos or like mother's tears or like those kind of plants that are really hardy that can be picked up and put back in the soil. They are quite creatures of habit. So once you kind of realize where they do like to burrow, you can then start putting plants in different places. But initially, when you're setting up, you have to think about, is the frog going to kind of kill this plant?
So, speaking of eating things, what diet are we going to feed our Pac-Man frogs? Again, this is another thing that's arguably quite controversial when looking online. So, a lot of people will say start them off on insects and then move them on to things like rats and mice when they are older. Now, personally, to me, how I would do it. Not sure if you might agree, you might disagree with this, Ellie. But I literally primarily feed mine just insects. So they are a insectivorous species. The odd occasion, if I'm feeling nice, if I've got like a leftover pinky or something like that, if I've been feeding snakes, then on the odd occasion, then I will obviously give them some sort of whole prey like that. But that is on literally the odd odd occasion. So we're talking every couple of months or so. Is this something you would typically do, or would you do something a little bit different?
I try and feed as wide range as possible. So, like you, I primarily feed insects, and that's dubias, locusts. They also will take worms, silkworms, those kind of things. And then I will feed whole prey items. So they will take mice, they'll take fish as well, like freshwater fish, little frozen ones. They in the wild they would actually eat quite a lot of amphibians as well. That's entirely why they've got those two teeth. They're popping teeth for eating other frogs. But I don't. So I haven't yet, but I really want to get hold of frogs' legs to do that because I think that would be really cool.
Right then, so moving on to supplementation. So just like with reptiles, we still would recommend your supplementation. Ellie, in your crazy little frog brain, what else would we do in terms of supplementation? Will we still use the same regimes, or do we do something a little bit different?
I would use just a bog standard regime, the same as I would anything else. So using calcium on every single feed, unless you're feeding a whole prey item such as a pinky, which are naturally quite high in calcium anyway. And then I would use a multivit once a month because you should be gut loading their diet so they get all of those little micronutrients anyway.
So it's basically exactly the same as what we're doing with our reptiles anyway. So, okay, perfect. So in terms of like behavior, what common behaviors are typically seen in Pac-Man frogs?
Usually sit and wait.
I knew you were going to say something along those lines.
Yeah, so they are usually quite sedentary. They're usually very much a no-touch animal. They have quite some interesting defense tactics to try and get you to leave them alone. So, like a stress response might be at first you see them like puff themselves up, and then that might resort to them standing on their legs and kind of like pushing themselves up. They'll also even scream as well. So it's a horrible noise. I've never witnessed it, but yeah, it doesn't take a lot to look on YouTube and find it. So generally they're very much like hands off, and the most enjoyment usually is kind of seeing them just doing their own thing.
What common health problems do we typically see in the captive environment when it comes to Pac-Man frogs? So are they susceptible to the same things that reptiles are? So things like vitamin deficiencies, like metabolic bone disease, etc., etc. Or are there any other different ones that we should look for?
So they can suffer like any animal with a wide range of different things. So primarily the main things you'll see is metabolic bone disease, and that is, usually occurs first with the deformity of the skull. So they don't develop a decent head shape. They kind of look like little pugs. They're very snub nosed. That's kind of usually a sign that that animal is suffering quite severely. The other thing that they really suffer with is obesity. If you actually look at wild photographs of Pac-Man frogs, it's a head with a little body, but we tend to see like a balloon with a little head and little legs sticking out. That is completely not natural. That isn't a Pac-Man frog at all. And with obesity and feeding too much prey items such as mice and things like that, they can get the exact same thing that my white stray frog has, which is where the fat actually builds up within the eyeballs. That is something that is not reversible. It makes them completely blind, and it's just really sad.
Yeah, because like it's at the end of the day, it's obviously within your control and stuff. So in terms of like food quantity and stuff, how often would you recommend like feeding the Pac-Man frog?
So it entirely depends on the size of the prey. So most people recommend when they're babies feeding them almost every single day. I've never done that. I would say once a week of a decent sized meal is better for them than lots of little meals. If you think their natural behavior in the wild is to wait, something decent will come along, they would eat that and then they would spend time digesting. Their digestive system is not as quick as ours, but it's also really, really efficient. So you want them to consume a large item and then completely have an empty digestive system. When they're empty, that's their healing stage. And then once their immune system's back up and running again, then they should be eating again. So you want to give them a decent break.
So moving on to brumation slash estivation. So you touched up on it a little bit earlier in the video, but do these animals brumate and do they estivate? And could you give us a brief summary of what they are?
Yes, so in the wild, they naturally go through periods of drought, and in those times, they would naturally cocoon themselves in like a hard husk of a skin layer, and they would sit in dormancy until the rain came. And as soon as they get washed with water, they kind of come back to life. It's not something that's been proven currently to have any health benefit. It actually puts the frog in quite a lot of stress, so we don't do it in captivity.
So it's not something that we would typically recommend. So if the frog is doing that, potentially look at like your humidity, substrate, etc., those kinds of things.
Yeah, so the general recommendation is, when if you are to find your frog like that, is to place it into its bowl of water. It will then naturally kind of like wake back up again, and then you have to look at how humid you're keeping it and kind of reevaluate that.
Okie dokie. So in terms of like items that we can obviously get for our Pac-Man frogs, be it like enrichment pieces, so like furnishings, etc., is there anything that you would say like, look, just don't buy? It can be, like I said, things like enrichment, dietary bits and bobs, heating, lighting, that kind of thing.
So much.
What are the main ones?
So any pre-formulated diet, such as I think there's something called like Pack Attack or anything like that, I would completely stay away from it. It's full of chemicals, fillers. It's not a complete diet. Just don't bother. Why would you bother when you could feed them a nice natural berry diet? Things like plastic furnishing and things like that, plastic plants, anything like that, I just completely would avoid, because if they do swallow it, then you've got real hard risk of impaction. Do not use a deep heat projector on that animal. For the love of God, do not use a deep heat projector.
So that's quite interesting that you should say that, to be fair. So I saw online that a lot of people were using deep heat projectors on obviously their Pac-Man frogs. Now, the reason why there was, well, it needs infrared, A and B, etc. Now, yes, that is a thing. They will utilize infrared A and B, but what is it specifically about deep heat projectors that shouldn't really be used with Pac-Man frogs?
There's many vets who are concerned about deep heat projectors causing dehydration in our reptiles by heating the water molecules beneath the surface of the skin, and that that is what is being heated. And if you think amphibian has a really porous, sensitive, thin skin, they are very, very prone to being dehydrated, and that's very negative for them. putting a deep heat projector on top of them is probably the worst heat source that you could put on top of them.
So just going back to it, just stick with like halogen, like heat sources, that type of thing. And that about does it for this episode. So thank you very much for sticking all the way through to the end. And also a very big thank you to Ellie Hills for helping me out in this video. So Ellie does have her own YouTube channel called Hills Reptiles. What I'll do, I'll pop a link in the description down below. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Ta-ra!